Live from the studios of the Cuban Heritage Foundation in Las Vegas, Nevada. This is Way to Go with Brown Sugar, Spice.
And Eric in the middle.
This week, we would like to share with you our thoughts on Hurricane Ian and its effects on, let's call it, communism versus capitalism. We are also going to be speaking about the prisoner swap that took place between the United States and Venezuela. So, to start off, we're going to talk briefly about Venezuela, and I'm going to let Eric go directly into it.
Right. So recently, the Biden administration exchanged 7 U.S. prisoners in Venezuela. Most of them were people who worked for Citgo and who were detained sometime during 2020. One of them was an ex-Marine and was accused of being a spy. Who knows if there was some validity to that? But in any case, the vast majority of these people who were detained were simply just working on a job.
Well, Citgo is a petroleum company, so
It's
that's
a private petroleum
And
company.
actually, Eric, the vast majority of these 7 people have been imprisoned for over 4 years.
Yeah,
Right.
they have been.
So
This isn't something that was new.
yeah,
Mhm.
it's really sad what's going on right now. The United States basically traded these 7 Americans for 2 nephews of Venezuela's first lady. These individuals had been convicted of drug smuggling, and they were serving an 18-year prison sentence.
They are called the narco sobrinos, which means narco nephews in English.
Is not uncommon for these communist countries to develop these narco-terrorism type alliances.
Well, particularly Venezuela. I mean,
Yeah.
Venezuela is the narco state. I mean, Mexico is, but in Mexico's case, it's more like there's a lot of influence from the narcos on the government and a lot of pressure and pull. But in the case of Venezuela, Venezuela is the narco regime at this point.
Yes. And the other part that was really interesting to me was I didn't realize that Maduro's wife was also like Speaker of the House in Venezuela. I'm starting to see a pattern with these communist countries. They have their family members be vice presidents and speakers and everything, so they like to keep it in the family.
Well,
Yeah.
it's not the only way to do a communist country, but I mean, you've noticed, the
Yeah.
most obvious example is North Korea.
Yeah.
I mean, every single communist country puts family members in some position of power. Sometimes it's just a way to fill a seat, but other times, like in this case, or heck, let's think about Cuba even.
Yes,
Raul
exactly.
Castro, Fidel Castro.
Keep it all in the family.
Keep it all in the family.
Corrupt family.
Exactly. And basically, these individuals that were traded for these prisoners are really people that have done a lot of damage to the United States. When we think about the amount of drugs that are flowing into this country, it's simply amazing that we would even be willing to do such swap.
It's not equivalent.
No,
It's
exactly.
not even close.
I
These,
mean,
these guys were working probably in the petroleum industry, and these other guys are narco terrorists.
yeah.
It's not
Well,
even close.
what that personally says to me is that this is a thawing of relations, and it's done with a very particular intention, and it's called oil. Right now, we need Venezuelan oil because the current administration does not want to drill. Oil prices keep going up and up and up, and having Venezuela as an oil partner is definitely a benefit to the United States.
Well, especially since they shut down the second pipeline from Canada. So we kind of dissed the people of Canada.
Exactly.
So now we need to go find somebody else. And it looks bad if we're purchasing oil from Russia.
Yeah. And I mean, it's very interesting that you said that, because I want to read a tweet, and you're going to have to bear with me because I'm translating in stream at here. But this is a tweet by Luis Vicente Leon. He is the president of Data Analysis Inquiry in Venezuela. And his opinion was as follows: I believe that the bilateral negotiation between these two countries, the United States and Venezuela, with respect to these prisoners and freeing them from both countries, is an excellent piece of news. And it shows the opportunities of consolidating more negotiations, humanitarian negotiations, petroleum negotiations, and political negotiations in the following months. And it seems like a lot of people, both Venezuelan Americans and Venezuelans in the country themselves, have really bagged on this guy. They really do not like this guy, and they view him as complicit. And I mean, the Venezuelan response has been one of anger towards this entire towards this trade, from what I've seen.
They see it as a betrayal. I mean, any of the Venezuelans that are hoping that the United States will somehow keep Maduro, in his place, so to speak, not in power, but kind of curtail the power that he has, have just seen him give him back his nephews.
Exactly.
So,
yeah, and not just any nephews either. I mean, these are some of the worst of the worst. I mean, I keep thinking of parallels between the time that we traded Bo Bergdahl for not one, not two, but 5 high-ranking Al-Qaeda terrorists back in the early 2010s.
Well, and we also traded Cuban spies for Alan Gross, who was working for USAID inside of Cuba. So our negotiations to have our prisoners released, in my opinion, are normally very poor. The exchanges just they have no balance whatsoever.
And that's assuming that you think that this is more incompetence rather than collusion, or even a desire for collusion.
Well, I think it's wishful thinking to think that it's incompetence. I think that there are so many people involved in this, and the quote that you read, that there's probably something much deeper.
No, definitely this is about oil. There was also a prisoner swap done with Iran. And as everybody knows, this administration is really wanting to go back to the table to rebuild that consensus so that Iran does not develop a nuclear weapon, which they will. They're already pretty much on their way to that. But I think this is another move that we're heading towards an Iran nuclear deal of some type.
Again, and here's the, this is just so messed up, because who is Iran's ally? Well, Russia, of course. So are we playing these back doors kinds of, oh, well, we won't buy oil from Russia, but maybe we'll buy oil from Venezuela and from Iran and all these other potentially damaging countries that have alliances even with Russia, because that's who they are.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of funny business going on. I mean, I was just listening to the President's Daily Brief podcast this morning, and gosh, I can't remember his name, but it's a podcast that I definitely recommend if you want to keep abreast of foreign affairs. But his claim was that China was actually buying natural gas from Russia and then selling that same natural gas back to Europe. I mean, the way our geopolitical relations are going all over the world, I mean, not just the United States, but the West in general. So I'm talking about NATO/EU nations, United States, Canada. It's just totally warped.
Well, we're moving things around to save face, so to speak, because if that's what's happening is Russia's selling it to China, China's selling it to Europe, so then Europe's leaders don't have to say that they're financially supporting Russia. these kinds of arrangements just don't.
Oh,
They don't
my
end
goodness.
And
up well.
this kind
They
of-
don't
way
end
to-
up well.
Way to go, for real.
And this kind of thing always happens on some level or another, usually on much, much smaller scales, though, and certainly not this brazen. I mean, this
Yeah,
is
I think
why
that's
everybody
what's so
needs to
shocking.
pay attention to their leaders and how well they negotiate and how well they think strategically about these types of things.
Yeah.
Exactly. Switching subjects, we want to talk about Hurricane Ian and its effects in different areas. I want to touch up on Puerto Rico first. As everybody
Absolutely.
knows, it went through Puerto Rico first,
Mhm.
and of course, their electric grid totally collapsed again. And so we're faced with the same situation over and over and over again. President Biden visited Puerto Rico yesterday. Did any of you see what took place?
Well, I heard him kind of imply that he was sort of like raised and associated with being Puerto Rican, which is outrageous to me. But
Well, especially because in Delaware, during the time that he was a child, they were in essence no Puerto Ricans to speak of. There were like 0.003% or something to that effect.
so he's lying again.
Well, he's not a very good liar, at
No.
least at his age. I
No.
mean, the whole utterance struck me as being very reminiscent of that convoluted story of corn pop he told
exactly,
long before he
exactly.
got elected to president. And
Yeah.
this was the reason why a lot of Democrats didn't even want to vote for him until, of course, they didn't really have a choice in their mind, at least.
Is the solution for the electric grid in Puerto Rico truly in the hands of hiring a contractor, or is the solution truly in the hands of the Army Corps of Engineers?
See, and I would say that at this point it should be in the Army Corps of Engineers, and we should be much more proactive. The irony is that we're sitting here potentially having talks with all these Latin American narco terrorist communities versus in countries versus actually rebuilding our own territory, which is actually Puerto Rico, and actually taking care of Florida. That it boggles the mind that we would even consider sending humanitarian aid to countries that are going to steal that product. I mean, if it's food that you send, you know that they're going to sell it to the people.
Needless to say, Spice is talking particularly about Cuba. And I want to talk about what happened with Hurricane Ian in Cuba. Hurricane Ian went through Pinar del Rio. Was there damage? Of course there was. There was a lot of damage. A lot of homes were destroyed. And of course, the electric grid in that area just absolutely collapsed. But the Cuban government is using
Yep.
it's using Hurricane Ian as the scapegoat for what's truly happening inside of that island, which is basically a complete collapse of their system.
Yep.
Not just the electric grid.
No,
which
not just the infrastructure.
basically doesn't work anymore. People are hours and hours and hours without electricity. Ioanni Sanchez, which a lot of people know who she is, she's a Cuban writer for a newspaper called 14 y Medio, actually wrote something to the effect that where she lived, there was the smell of rotten everything, rotten flesh, rotten food, that everything simply smelled rotten because they had gone for so many days without any electricity, any running water, just a total disaster. But I do have to add that, needless to say, the hotels, their 5-star hotels, had backup generators
Of course.
and had electricity. So there's no electricity, there's no running water, there's no food, there's nothing for the Cuban people. And then on top of that, there's extreme repression.
Yeah.
Extreme repression. They are actually right now in the process of drafting hundreds and hundreds of young people, young men,
Yes.
into the military so that they can go out and beat up on the Cuban and
Beat up protesters, to be specific.
yeah,
Well,
absolutely.
basically silence by violence.
Exactly. That's what it is. It's total. I mean, it's so fascist that it's a shame. It's truly shameful. Uh, you're looking at these kids and you're wondering, how did they get it in them to be this cruel and all action that will turn around and blackmail a lot of these kids. And I'm not saying that it's the case with everyone. Some of them are totally indoctrinated. But those who are not indoctrinated are given a stick so that they can repress the protesters. And they are basically blackmailed into doing this. If you don't do this, you will go to jail. If you don't do this, your family's going to pay. So the
And
regime.
when we're talking about the family paying, that means cutting off food. That means taking away their shelter. That means a lot of things that
but
these
mostly
families.
but mostly prison. I mean, it's
Yes.
not it's already bad enough that Cuba itself is one big prison. They are I mean, the amount of prisoners, the amount of people that are going into prison in Cuba right now is it's just unbelievable.
Well, we need to talk about what prison is because it's nothing compared to what our prisons
No,
are.
our prisons are camps.
Yeah, they're
Summer camps.
recreational facilities.
Exactly.
compared to
They're
those.
summer camps.
I mean, they're horror stories about how people get put in solitary confinement for days. How these solitary confinement cells, which are small little rooms, they don't even have toilets. They have nothing, and these people don't have a regular diet. Family members have to provide food for anybody who's imprisoned. This is outrageous, but this is the way that they torture
Well,
people.
By the way, I'd like to
torture.
comment that a example of these people with the sticks
Behind
is
us.
right behind us on the screen behind us.
Yes, so that you can see that they're not. They're young. They're able-bodied.
But the most interesting thing about this picture behind us is that they're dressed in civilian clothes, and they're not civilians.
No.
Make no mistake, these young people are not civilians. These are people that have been drafted into the armed forces by the Castro regime
Yep.
to do exactly what they're doing. And it's all in the name of Fidel Castro, their fearless leader.
Well, all in the name of the Castro regime, because even though that man is dead, his relatives and his special buddies took advantage of everything that Fidel Castro was able to do.
They want to keep his evil legacy alive.
Absolutely.
Well, this is nothing unique when it comes to communism. Back in the, not so much these days anymore, but this was true back in the 60s and 70s in China. I mean, our friend Lily Tong Williams has described stuff like this. The young revolutionaries who would threaten and even beat up people. I don't think they were always dressed in plain clothes, but they did this kind of thing frequently.
There's something very different happening in Cuba today, and basically July 11th of last year marked a turning point on how much the Cuban people were actually willing to put up with. And right now, they're not going out just at night. People are out in the streets everywhere. Someone actually called me today and informed me that a bus full of these youngsters with sticks was actually stopped, and no one could get off of the bus because the bus was surrounded by protesters. I personally don't know how the regime plans to recover from this one. And the only way and this is my personal opinion, that they will recover from this one is if the United States of America comes to the rescue. For the very first time in 63 years, the regime has asked the United States for help.
For humanitarian help because of Hurricane Ian.
Yeah.
That's new.
And it's,
And-
I mean, they asked for help, and a lot of this does remind me of Matanzas, by the way. But I mean, they asked for help from Mexico, from Venezuela. The Cuban government, as we mentioned during our
Yeah, but
Carlos,
during that time, they didn't want help from the United States.
that's true. The
We-
point,
we
the point I'm
would've-
making is
We would
that
have put that fire out and boom.
the point I'm making is that in the past, Cubans are more than willing to accept help from either countries that are aligned with them
Exactly.
or organizations that are aligned with them, which is why Puentes de Amor's donations were accepted by the Cuban government.
Right.
But if you invite, say, like Save the Children or whatever,
or the American Red Cross or
Yeah.
something like that. I mean, they don't want anything that's really legitimate. They want people that are aligned with their supporting the regime.
Yeah, and needless to say, when Puentes de Amor or anyone for that matter tries to claim that they're helping the Cuban people, they're helping the Cuban government that turns around and takes everything that's donated to them and actually sells it to the Cuban people.
Yeah.
It's the same thing that's true with remittances too. They basically, when you send remittances to Cuba, please do not do this, by the way. But if you send them, they basically are routed to Cuba's central bank,
Mhm.
and they give about like 10% to the people.
If that.
And at face value. And
Yeah.
as I said last time, I mean, go and watch Manuel Milanés if you are good enough at Spanish to understand him. He will explain to you that the face value of the Cuban peso is not the actual value of the Cuban peso.
No, it's all manipulation.
I personally believe that this is all planned. I think that there's a relationship with what Cuba is doing right now with regards to the visit from the State Department and the visit from Cardinal O'Malley to Havana about a month ago. Things started changing as far as immigration was concerned. The United States reopened the embassy, and now they're working to expedite a lot of the petitions that basically were shut down during COVID. So I think that they've been in conversations. I definitely have the feeling, and I really pray and hope that I'm not correct, but I do believe that the Biden administration will come to the rescue of Cuba again, just like we saw during the Obama administration when Venezuela indicated that they could no longer provide 100,000 barrels of oil per day, which Cuba was in turn selling to China. The minute Venezuela put the brakes on, we came to the rescue. And there was a mirage of an opening on behalf of the Cuban government. None of that was real. It was simply a mirage. If I could send a message to President Biden, I would tell him, please don't do this. Be on the side of democracy. Be on the side of freedom. Do not go and rescue the Cuban government once more. The Cuban people need help. The Cuban people need food. They need medicine. They need aid. But more than anything, they need freedom. So if we're going to help the Cuban people, what we need to do is totally the opposite. We need to say, oh, you need our help now? Well, now we're not going to give it. And what we need to do is shut everything down.
Yep.
People do not want to understand that if nothing goes in and nothing comes out, we don't have to shoot anyone.
No, you don't have to have boots on the ground.
You don't. There's no war, no shots fired. Nothing. They will collapse because they're already there.
Yeah.
They just need a little to collapse a little bit more.
During the Gaddafi years, one of the tactics that the U.S. government used was to block all arms shipments uh, into Libya, and sure enough, Gaddafi fell within a week. Now, I don't really want to call that a good example of U.S. diplomacy because there was a lot of other failures, and today Libya is a absolutely anarchic state where actual real slaves are being sold in markets. So while I'm but all that being said, the original goal, which was to topple the Gaddafi regime, actually was realized. And something like that could happen with the Castro regime. But unlike Libya, Cuba has and it's a history that's being forgotten now, but it has a history of democracy. There's a huge Cuban exile community in South Florida who would be absolutely ready and eager to provide aid the second that they could, and without supporting the actual communist regime.
Absolutely. Uh, I think we've pretty much said how we feel with regards to aid to Cuba. Once again, please,
Please
don't
don't.
do it. Don't
Please
do
don't.
it.
Because it won't go to the Cuban people. It will go to support, bolster, and basically strengthen the grip of the tyrannical regime. That's not the answer.
Yeah, and I'm going to repeat what I've said several times. I mean, if you're tempted to think, well, China, I mean, first of all, I'm not going to debate whether or not China is valid, but let's assume it is. In China, you send money or food to your family member, it goes to your food, it goes to your family member for the most part. But if you do that in Cuba, you're sending it by proxy. The government of Cuba is the middleman for any and all enterprise, and not even the government itself, specifically military and paramilitary organizations. Really, you have to think of the economy of Cuba as being a lot more like North Korea than anything else. It's basically North Korea with tourism that's actually fun for foreigners.
And great weather, I guess.
Exactly. Now turning to Ian in the United States, as we all know, it went in through the Gulf of Florida, and it went in through the Fort Myers, Naples area. It has caused a lot of destruction. Sanibel Island was pretty much leveled. You can't get in and out of the island unless you're being airlifted or taken out by a boat, because the bridge it's gone. It's all very sad. But with that said, I think that Governor Ron DeSantis has done a phenomenal job. I think that by him declaring a state of emergency almost a week ahead of the hurricane arriving in Florida, he was able to get a lot of aid, a lot of help in Florida before the hurricane actually hit. I keep seeing continuously how people's electricity slowly but surely is coming back. The first day there were close to 2 million people without electricity. Now I think it's under 1 million. So obviously they're working very, very hard to help everyone and to make this as painless as possible. Even though for those that lost their homes and lost all of their belongings, there's no such thing as painless. But we live in the United States of America, where we have a FEMA.
Yes, we do.
Unfortunately, in Cuba, they don't have anything like that. We live in the United States of America, where we have insurance. This is going to be an astronomical cost to insurance companies, but we have it. And this is a big advantage. This is the big difference between living in a communist country and living in capitalism, where you know for sure that someone is going to come to your rescue and we don't really need help from another country.
Right.
We handle our problems ourselves.
And we're doing this at the same time as we're sending a whole lot of money to Ukraine as well. It's very interesting that you bring up the whole communist country thing. I mean, Esteban Hernandez of Contrapodernos
Mhm.
was pointing out, and he was kind of approaching this from a humorous angle, but he basically pointed out that the way that the United States is after a Category 5 hurricane is still better somehow than an average day in Venezuela. And, that's Venezuela. We're talking about Cuba, where, I mean, it's so much more severe in many ways, and not just during a hurricane. Honestly, I might be going out on a limb, but I honestly think that a good day in Cuba without any hurricanes or any other natural disasters and the like is probably worse than the worst parts of Florida right now.
Absolutely.
Well, because as we've spoken for months now, they don't have power for 12, 16 hours a day. So how can you keep, a refrigerator on? How can you do anything?
Yeah.
How can you cook anything if you don't have any power most of the time?
And that's because of a fire that was more due to human error than anything else. I mean, the initial spark that caused the fire was an act of God, but everything that happened since was absolute human error and incompetence.
Mm-hmm.
No, I think we were having problems even before then, because honestly, it's the tail end of the regime. They have sucked every single resource out of that island. They're so greedy and so selfish that they don't even allow people. Until just recently, they wouldn't allow anybody to have a little community garden. I don't know if Americans can understand this, and I say this being an American. The fact that the government controls whether you can actually grow a garden. It may be foreign to you, but this is the way it is. You cannot do anything without the permission of the regime.
Yeah, you can't get salt, even though large parts of the country are right next to the ocean. You can't get fish.
Oh, it's an island. It's surrounded by the ocean. It's
surrounded by seafood,
it's
surrounded
unbelievable.
by salt, and you can't have that, and you can't grow certain things. I mean, some of the biggest agricultural things have to do with the raising of the tobacco leaves, and all of that is sold only and exclusively to the government, that then does their own business with it.
Well, and you know what's truly amazing to me, that in the midst of all of this going on,
Yeah.
Cuba is still focusing on propaganda.
Yeah.
In Argentina, a couple of days ago, they were having a tourism fair where they were really promoting Cuba as one of the best destinations. I'm like, really? What exactly do you want people to go and see? Because no matter what, they have to go through Havana. And right now, the people of Havana are in the streets. As a matter of fact, a couple of days ago, the airports were shut down.
Yes, they were.
So, to me, it's mind-boggling. This morning, they actually were having a festival of new vehicles.
Vehicles?
And I'm like,
okay.
I'm like, really?
Who gets them?
New vehicles for transportation. The whole thing is just, it's insanity.
Well, that's why I thought it was very important to bring up and educate about the election that was an absolute farce last week, because that's the perfect example of trying to show a good face to the foreign community and to make people think that they're trying to contribute to human rights, when in reality they're dealing with, and I mean, whatever you think about same-sex marriage, this is one of those questions that, given the circumstances in Cuba, needs to be put close to the bottom of the list.
Yeah, priorities are being able to feed yourself.
Yeah, I mean, call me a bigot, but I think that being able to feed yourself is more important than that.
Well, and also, the children. I mean, right now is a perfect example that children do not belong to their parents. They're being drafted into the military.
Yeah.
So Parents don't have a say
Yeah,
Right
it
for
was a
in what happens with their children.
it was a plebiscite that gave you that if you were a same-sex couple, it gave you the right to adopt children who can then be drafted into the military to beat up people on the other side of the country.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean
I mean-
that is using children to perform criminal acts.
Exactly.
And if that's what it takes to keep this regime alive, then I think they're pretty desperate, and I think that we don't need to contribute in making them strong again.
No, we most certainly don't. And again, it is something that worries me and concerns me, that this administration could possibly use the fact that there was
A
some,
hurricane.
and no,
Something.
not just a hurricane, some type of
Disaster.
election that appears to be democratic.
Oh, please.
These people are evil. These people are not going to change. There will be no changes as long as they remain in power. And the only way to get them out is by closing up that island. Nothing in, nothing out. I understand that there's a lot of people that think, oh my God, that's criminal. You know, I have to get food to my sister or to my mother and what have you. I hear your pain, but personally, I would like to see your sister and your mother not have to worry about what they eat every single day of their lives.
Yeah.
So we need to be willing to sacrifice something for freedom. If you're not willing to sacrifice something for freedom, then you don't deserve freedom. That's the bottom line. You have to sacrifice something for freedom. I truly admire that about Americans. Americans give their life for freedom. For Americans, there's nothing more freedom, because in freedom you function. In capitalism, you function.
And you flourish.
Exactly. You have an opportunity as an individual, to do something with your life. There is such thing as equal opportunity. So in a place where you are basically being ruled under a communist regime, they want to make you believe that the collective is more important than the individual. Here, we are taught that we have to volunteer, that we have to give to the poor, that we have to help other people in need. But we are not told or ever, you know, embedded with the fact that we cannot think as an individual and have desires as an individual for things in our lives.
I think when people think of collective societies, they're thinking, oh, everybody gets along, everybody's equal, everybody's happy. But unfortunately, the reality is that in this collectivism that they're trying to sell you, it really means that the oligarchs, the tyrants, they're the ones who decide what's in the best interest for each
And
individual.
And that's the key. And that's the key.
That's the problem.
And they're less than 1% of the population.
Isn't that crazy that less than 1% of the population could decide whether you live, die, eat, etc., etc.?
Now, to be clear, in this country, less than 1% of the population can cause major problems for you. But when's the last time that you saw people starving and being beaten up for speaking a bad opinion due to the ideas and the beliefs of an oligarch?
Yeah.
And if you're answering, well, such and such an example, that's why you need to vote.
Yeah,
Exactly.
By
that
the
is
way.
why you need to vote. And we're not saying that the United States is perfect, but what we are saying is we don't have to go through 12 hours of a blackout. We don't have to wonder whether our supermarkets
And
are
I'll
going
mind
to
you,
have
please, let's make
basics.
sure that people understand. We're talking about blackouts that have nothing to do with a natural disaster such as a hurricane.
Yeah,
We're
no.
talking about a country that shuts down its electricity because of lack of resources. And whose electricity do they shut down? The people's. not the tourists, not the 5-star hotels. The people are the ones that go for days and days without electricity, without running water. So basically, what it is collective misery.
Yep. That's the one thing.
Imposed collective misery.
Yeah.
I mean, a very common meme that's circulating through Facebook, through Cuban Facebook, is their children, which is the children of the elites, and you see them wearing designer clothes, hanging out on yachts and the like, and then you see your children in the lower frame, which is basically kids like the ones on the screen earlier, who are being sent out onto the streets to basically beat up other people.
Or to put out fires that they're ill-equipped to do, and then they die in the process. I mean, young people are basically expendable for the government. They don't really care about them.
Mm-hmm.
So these are things that we need to keep in mind whenever somebody tries to say, oh, well, we need to be merciful and we need to be compassionate and we need to give all these things without conditions. This is crazy. You can't. This is just feeding the monster.
If a parent is abusing a child and you take no action to, at the very least, limit the parent's ability to abuse a child, and you use the excuse as being, oh, but then the child won't have a mother, I mean, are you really helping the child? Now, the Cuban people are not children, of course, but they are being abused by an authority. And I really don't see why the logic of so many people is to just say, oh, well, let's reward the Cuban government by opening things up, or let's put old enmities aside when we haven't even dealt with the old
I think our leaders need to do a better job of understanding who they're dealing with and the things that they say. Going back to the Florida situation, that I personally think it's been handled quite well. For someone to even remotely want to indicate that this has to be treated at a starting point of equity, it's mind-blowing to me, because if you know anything about the demographics of Florida, you know that in the area that was most
devastated
hit by the hurricane, it's not an area where you have predominantly Black people or predominantly, minorities. Yes, there are some minorities, but they are not the vast. It needs to be the people of Fort Myers, Naples, and the surrounding areas,
Exactly.
Sanibel Island. They need help.
Right.
This is not the time to be thinking about skin color or background. It's the people of that area in Florida that need the help of everyone that can help them.
Well, you're talking about the difference between an ideologue and someone with common sense, Maria.
Or even conscience.
Some of the things that people say, some of the things that they want to happen are just ridiculous at some point.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that when a hurricane goes through, it doesn't care what color your skin is.
No.
So it's going to impact anybody that lives there. It doesn't matter what your skin color is. It doesn't matter what your religion is. It's a hurricane, and it's going to go through a geographical area. So everybody that lives in that geographical area are the people that need to be helped.
I do want to say one thing in closing with regards to Cuba. This is a time of unity. All Cuban Americans, Cuban nationals that live outside of the island, this is a time of unity. To me, it's a time of break it or make it, if I may say so. We need to unite the organizations that can make a difference. We need to develop leadership. We need to prepare ourselves to a post-Castro Cuba. This is eminent because we have to really believe that the United States is going to be on the right side of history and that they are going to come to the aid of the Cuban people and not the Cuban government. And if this is the case, the end of the regime is close. It's not going to be years from now. It is going to be very close. This is a system that has totally collapsed. There's nothing left there. So this is a time of unity. I want to make that call of unity to all of the organizations, to anyone that wants to get behind us and help us at this time of dire need for freedom and democracy. I invite you to join us. We are going to call on other organizations, and we are definitely going to make plans to unite with those that want to make a difference for a free Cuba. It is now or never. There's no gray areas here right now. I want to thank all of you for being with us another Tuesday night, and we look forward to next week where you're going to be seeing another. We're going to be sharing with you on Way to Go. Thank you so much.